Hello and welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. And this week, I'm delighted to be joined by Christof Rühl, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University, today sitting in Germany. Christof, thanks for joining us for the Halftime Talk this week.
Good morning or good afternoon, whenever it's
Yes,
broadcasted.
absolutely. Well, we are recording this on February the 1st. And of course, let's start by talking about today's significance. We're obviously the second month into the new year, Donald Trump presidency, well on its way. Today is a date where Trump has said that, the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico will kick in. And we've had now murmurings in the last 24, 48 hours that he's going to extend his tariff threat to the EU, etc. So, as we sort of move now well into 2025, I mean, what do you foresee is the sort of direction of travel for this whole tariff threat story from the US? And what would you see as the main sort of consequences if indeed it materializes?
I think there's two issues here. One is, as you said, if indeed it materializes. So to what an extent is this just posturing or negotiation tactics or, saying back and forth at the same time when you don't quite know where you're going? On that aspect, I cannot tell you anything more than what you already can guess yourself or what it's in all the newspapers. We just don't know. But the second one is we could look at the question of what do these tariffs do in general or in particular in the energy sector in the short term, in the long term, across different regions or different sectors. And on that one, I think we have, by history and by economic theory, have a quite fair idea what they do. And so the way I was thinking about this when I followed this chaotic debate was to say, okay, let's assume he goes ahead, build a very simplified model of it in my head. Let's assume 25%, as he said, on Mexico, Canada, everything, including oil and oil product imports, all energy imports, in fact. What would that do? And I think on that basis, one can estimate what's going to come, and then it becomes a matter of degree whether it actually materializes like that or not.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, the US is reliant on those countries, Canada, Mexico, EU, for about 60% in total of its imports. So clearly, I mean, if we just put oil aside for a minute, just the whole impact of the cost of that to the American economy surely would not be viable.
Well, it's not just the American economy. So we know two things from ancient economic history, but really from hundreds of years ago. One is that if you have benefits from trade, so if you specialize, you have specialization, so that this results into benefits for everyone. It's mutually advantage if you allow for free trade and countries can do whatever they do best and export this to each other. And the other one we know is that the size of the market is an important determinant of productivity gains. So since Adam Smith, since the late 18th century, we know that the size of the market determines the division of labor. And the division of labor, that's specialization, determines in the end the outcome, the productivity with which economies can operate. And the energy sector is a prime example of that. This is really, especially when you look at the region of North America, this is an integrated, extremely efficient, and extremely well fine-tuned, big market, production, distribution, refinement, consumption. And it is a market which benefits from scale because it's large, and it is a market which benefits from specialization because, so for example, thick Canadian crude comes to low risk Canadian crude comes to the Mideast because that refineries have been geared to that. There's pipeline infrastructure, so it's a market which will suffer when you disrupt it. And I think one can get one step further and you look at the global energy market. It is another example of both of the mutual benefits from trade. That's 100 years younger, that theory, and also from the benefits of scaling up, of having a sizable market. And you just think of the sanctions on Russia, and so to what an extent the fossil fuel market really stomached the shocks with minimal effect on the population. Few people would have thought this before. This is the direct result of trade, of the ability to trade, of the ability to store, and of be free to redirect and to follow price signals. Disrupting that will not be costless.
Of course, for everybody. And how do you think, Christoph? I mean, we have to, one has to make assumptions now as to what the exact percentage of tariffs will go through, if at all, whether it's on oil, gas, imports into the US or other materials like aluminium and steel, etc. Let's just say that we proceed with some kind of tariff hike from the US. How do countries in the EU, how does Canada, for example, respond? What tools do they have, do you think, that they could use to respond with if they were put in that position?
So we start from what we think we know, which is that normally, there are exceptions, but normally erecting tariffs in an integrated global market or in the integrated North American market will, in the long term, end up being a bad thing for the aggregate of people, for all of the people taken together involved. And then we go back to today, and then we can go through it, what will happen. The first instance, suppose, to keep it really simple, suppose these 25% are introduced. The first instance, the American consumer will be faced with more expensive imports of Canadian and also to some extent Mexican crude. And that means that there are price increases in the US. That means it might be a slight effect on demand, and the consumer and others will see to find other supplies, which could lead in the medium term to an increase in domestic US production, compensating for some of these imports from Canada and Mexico. That's what Trump is speculating on. That would mean an increase in domestic production and employment in domestic income. And of course, it will also lead to an increase in tax revenues for the US from these border taxes. But in the long term, the Canadians will suffer. They have to redirect their output. It will compete against other fuels somewhere else, coming from somewhere else, and will lower profit margins potentially for other producers. So you have a price effect which goes up in the US, and then in the medium long term will be counterbalanced, probably, hopefully, by increased domestic production until the system is readjusted, which can take forever given that there's pipelines and refineries and all this heavy equipment involved. And on the other hand, you have the exporters, Mexico and Canada, who are now losing some share of their market and have to redirect their exports elsewhere, which will crowd out and compete with other exporters who have occupied these markets and lead in the short term to perhaps lower prices in these other jurisdictions if it's not compensated for by the higher costs of shipping and all of that. But that will be a marginal effect. Basically will lead to more disruption and to some of the other exporters and producers paying part of the bill of the losses of the Canadian and the Mexican producers because they now have to compete against crude which used to be imported from Canada and Mexico into the US. So that's the initial situation. And then over time, the system will rebalance. And in the end, if these tariffs prevail and if other tariffs may be added or so, you will overall have a slightly higher cost of crude on the planet because of the higher costs involved of refining, of shipping, of paying taxes and all of this, and that is not beneficial, is detrimental for the consumer. And because don't forget, energy is something very special. We're not talking about taxes on cars versus motorbikes, or Adidas sports shoes versus Nike sports shoes. We are talking about a product which goes directly and indirectly into any kind of economic activity, commercially traded energy, if we look beyond crude.
Absolutely.
And that means it's a negative impact on production and consumption globally. It's small, and over time diminishing, but visible. And of course, also it will prevent these markets from becoming more efficient, more integrated, from exploiting technical progress on the scale they used to have.
Yeah. And also it's going to be inflationary, of course, isn't it? And that would presumably contradict another objective of Trump, which is his Fed policy preference, which is to, drop interest rates this year and keep dropping them again, keep that liquidity in the market. But how can the Fed do that if he's pursuing inflationary policies on the tariff side? I mean, so does that again tell us that he's unlikely to really be too hawkish on the tariff front, because it'll completely contradict internally also what he wants his central bank to do?
We have to be very careful, and now it's getting a bit muddy or complicated, I'm afraid. Because one effect is a relative price effect, which I just described, which has nothing to do with inflation. It means that crude from Mexico or Canada is now becoming relatively more expensive than, say, crude from the Bakken or from somewhere in the US or from other countries who can import to the US without these tariffs. So it's a change in the relative prices, which then works its way through the system. The other is the fact that, of course, this goes through an increase in pump prices. This goes through an increase in nominal prices, the price consumers pay in the US. If the additional income in the form of the border tariffs which is generated and which is causing this increase in pump prices were to be spent to avoid monetary policy staying as loose as it is, you could neutralize that effect on the inflation level. But that is extremely unlikely, which is not just sloppiness. Everybody assumes, of course, it leads to an increase in the prices will be accommodated by the authorities without any change in policy, and the increase in taxes will not lead to a more balanced budget. But the implicit assumption here is the deficit will continue to rise. And these people are probably right who predict this. And then, yes, in the short term, you have an inflationary impetus, which is not to be underestimated because energy goes directly and indirectly into everything. So it will work its way through the system as well.
Yeah, not necessarily on paper in the CPI, but on the ground, of course, it's going to work into system. And the cost of other commodities that the US may be importing for its other, manufacturing, onshoring everything that they want to do. Of course, that's the objective. But again, a lot of objectives that Trump has set out. Christof, let's talk a bit about sanctions as well, because that's something else he's been very vocal about in terms of, the US already applied more stringent sanctions on Russia under Biden towards in the second half of last year, admittedly having a bit of an impact on people who are countries importing some of that Russian crude. Again, Trump, how do you think he's likely to use that weapon, if you like, as he moves forward?
Before we go there, let me just add one little piece of information to what you said about the inflation side of it, because the first estimates are just about to come out, are coming out gradually. And what people have calculated is that the cost of gasoline at New York Harbor, which is currently around $2 a gallon, with a 25% tax, could go up as much as by 50%. And what they have calculated is likely the pump prices in the Midwest, which is most dependent on refineries processing only Canadian crude, might go up in a range from 10 to 25 cents per gallon. So that's just to conclude that first part. That's the immediate price hikes we are looking at, and they would then scale down over time. So if he accomplishes something with like cheaper international crude prices, it's probably manageable in the short term. And that leads us to the sanctions thing. I always feel a bit, I was thinking about feeling a bit awkward because as an economist, my immediate reaction to tariffs and sanctions and all kinds of trade restrictions is that it's not a good thing for the common good, but it's making life unnecessarily complicated and more expensive. And yet I've argued and written that in the case of preventing Russia from continuing its war and its attack on the Ukraine, sanctions not only are maybe a good idea, but if you do sanctions, they better be implemented rightly. And we have not really done that. These energy sanctions have not really been biting on Russia. And I think the connecting line here is that if it is true that sanctions basically are hurting various economies, and so sanctions do the same thing, and their target meant to do this, but the West wanted to avoid the pain of the part of that hurt. They wanted to really have their cake and eat it too. They wanted Russia to suffer revenues from selling raw materials, without being prepared to pay higher prices to these raw materials themselves. I mean, we have a completely unique historical situation. Russia, by most accounts, is still the world's biggest exporter of commodities and of energy, tradable energy. So that's only fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal. 12% about all the cross-border transactions in the world are coming from Russia. And its main enemy, if I can say so, the G7, with plus or minus a few countries around them, are producing about half of global GDP. And of course, with the exception of the US, all based on imported energy. And so you have really sort of an economic battle of the giants. Moreover, the Ukraine event was not a sudden event. It happened, started in 2014, as you know, with Crimea and all of that. So both sides had plenty of time to think about what to do other than military intervention. It was clear the West was in no mood to military intervene. So they were thinking about what is legitimately called economic warfare. And programs were proposed. And if you remember how that started, it started all on the financial side with confiscating Russian central reserves, and trying to connect Russia, disconnected from the payment system. The energy side, which is much more important, came in only later. Now,
and that has remained, as you've said earlier, fairly efficient. And of course, the intention of the whole price cap, etc., was so that Russian energy would continue to flow to an extent. I mean, let me just sort of interrupting you there on that front. Let's make an assumption as economists and say that Trump does does get stricter on sanctions on Russia to the where it does start to impact their oil flows, there's plenty of supply, isn't there, elsewhere in the market for this year and year ahead, really. If you look at a 12-month outlook, weak demand, extra capacity supply, what's the problem?
Yeah, that is the bridge he could use and across he could walk. So far, these sanctions have been completely, not completely, ineffective, period. And the reason for this is that they have not been binding every step. Like we don't import Russian crude anymore in Europe, and then it's allowed to be imported by China or India. We don't insure their ships anymore, and they're allowed to build a shadow fleet. We have a price cap, but it's not informed in their bilateral negotiations between them. Every step along the way had an escape clause, which, surprise, surprise, Russia used. Now the situation, and the reason for that, as we said earlier, is that the West was not prepared to pay the bill in form of higher prices for hurting Russian revenues. Now the situation has changed a little bit because we have to connect Russia and OPEC. We have, on the one
Yeah.
hand, still the dependency of a war economy like Russia's, which will turn fragile very fast if they're cut off from these regular revenues from energy exports. And you have OPEC, and OPEC sits on 5.5, round about million barrels of spare capacity, and has 3 times already had to postpone announced production increases. And the reason is very simple, which is that non-OPEC supply is so large that for the foreseeable future, it doesn't require any OPEC increases. Maybe just the opposite. Maybe in order for OPEC to stabilize prices at current level, somebody, and it can only be OPEC, will have to cut out some more
Yes.
production as before. And so that is the idea. You could say, okay, Trump, with all his impetus, with all his grandeur, with all this, I'm coming, everything I do immediately, could pick up the phone and talk to OPEC and say, look, guys, here's a huge carrot. We are going to be serious on Russia. We really undermine their ability with attacking the shadow fleet and everything touching it to export. And there will be a crude shortfall in the world. And you have the spare capacities and you don't know how to increase production to get rid of them. Here you go. You play your traditional
That would
role.
be perfect, wouldn't it? I mean, that'd be a great solution for OPEC because, of course, they want to increase in April, don't they? As soon as April. And that there's a lot of scrutiny as to whether they actually will be able to, given current market conditions. Again, maybe having to continue giving up a bit of their market share for the sake of just at least maintaining the prices where they are. But that would be a gift to them that would excuse them then from, betraying their fellow partner with an OPEC plus, Russia, right? This would be the US acting, and OPEC has to step in to stabilize markets.
Let's put it this way. It's an idea which is beautiful because it's so simple. And it's actually so simple that, it is just there staring us in the face. But not everything which is simple and beautiful is equally workable.
Yeah.
There are problems with this idea. Problem number one is we don't only have OPEC, we have OPEC plus, which is not only Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states as the main producers who have that spare capacity, but Russia as the senior partner. This idea, even if OPEC could pretend that they have been pressured or so, would probably mean the end of OPEC plus, or it would mean Russia dropping out of the OPEC plus association. Now, I don't think this is a real issue because 4 years ago, Saudi Arabia and Russia were prepared to go to a price war for market share. The way oil markets are, once you understand that we not only have a temporary problem, but that we are really just a few years away from oil demand peaking and plateauing, and that's what OPEC refuses to believe. Once you're in that situation, you're facing a shrinking market, everything will change. Because in a shrinking market, every producer, just to keep his market share constant, this includes OPEC, of course, will have to increase its just to keep its production constant, will have to increase its market share by definition. Market gets smaller. You want to export the same 100 barrels you exported before. You need to have a bigger market share. How do you do this? By competing against other producers. And at the end, who will be left standing are the cheapest producers, and they're sitting in the Gulf. So this kind of situation and this kind of threat of a price war will emerge anyway in the not too far future. And it will, of course, be one between Russia and America and Saudi Arabia, the biggest producers, in which the Middle Eastern countries have the best cards and the Russians have the worst cards.
And I mean, the shrinking market, of course, a big player in that is China, isn't it? I mean, in terms of, yes, it is still a huge consumer and growing. its economy, obviously at 5% or less, or more or less, one could argue, still of the very significant consumer. But there's no doubt a lot of increasing commentary that it is transitioning its economy into a different direction. That there's been peak gasoline and diesel demand, some people would say, in China already. That is a factor, isn't it? So, and which plays into that argument that you were just saying is inevitable. Let's get your take on where you see China's economy prospects in the year ahead, Christof. Again, would it be disappointing people as it did last year, or are things a little bit more predictable as we go forward now?
Into this in two ways. One is, as you said, as a big component of global demand. China and the Middle East are now the only regions where demand is still going up. And it plays a role, of course, this is the second little problem with this grand plan. It's not only about OPEC, but also about OPEC Plus. It's the first one. And the sanctions are not, have to be tightened. And China probably will bulk of that. That's the second part. But to your question, there was a period that from the summer 24 until maybe a few weeks ago, where every analyst just basically looked at China, 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 and they didn't know anything, oil analysts, about the macroeconomy of China. So they asked their macro colleagues, how is Chinese economy doing? And then they translated that into expectations of oil demand. This completely neglected the fact that China has a giant price advantage over other countries because of cheap Russia supplies, completely neglected that we are very clueless to the real import numbers coming from Russia into China, that we are very clueless to the real strategic reserves of China, so that every estimate about Chinese demand going up and down and changing the world, you would take with an even bigger grain of salt than usual demand estimates. Now, where I do things going, I think China's economy is gradually, obviously, adjusting to a much slower growth path. I don't think we will return to 8, 9, 10, 11% growth. That would be a complete anomaly. But I think they have the firepower, the will, and the knowledge to stop the decline. So far, their policy measures have been, in my view, appropriate, not throwing too much money at the problem, trying to deflate the bubbles they have in shadow banking, in the regional debt situation, in the housing markets. There are 5, 6 these areas, not just real estate. And avoiding a crash on the one hand and a reinflation on the other. So I think, pressured also curiously by the US policy and hostility, they will find a way to stabilize their economy, and it may be around 5, but more likely more like 4%, 4.5%. That's still pretty good for a large economy in international comparison. And that will stabilize the oil market situation. Demand will be lower. And then, of course, there is one other big issue here, which is the number of electric vehicles, which China is growing very fast. And China might just be the first big economy where we're actually seeing EVs taking out a chunk of oil demand.
And replacing combustion engine cars. I mean, they're exceeding in terms of purchases, but they're not yet quite replacing those, are they? But that is certainly a growth trajectory that hasn't been in dispute. Christof, but before we run out of time, I want to touch on that. You mentioned China taking in Russian oil. Let's talk about Iranian oil a bit, and also in the context of sanctions. There's been some chatter that Trump may hold back on, putting more stringent sanctions on Iran for now, deal with Russia first. What's the feeling you're getting out there in terms of whether, Iran will be hit harder, given, of course, in the context of the recent ceasefire in the region, hopes for a more stable year ahead on that front, I mean, and on a regional front?
Iran right now stands a little bit on the sidelines, and Trump right now has a lot of chips he can put on the table, and depending where they fall, Iran will be better off or in much bigger trouble. I think if Trump were to, this is hypothetical, but if he were to decide to tighten Russian sanctions to end the Ukraine war in a decent way, then in order to make this attractive for the Middle Eastern oil producers, there would have to be some more political carrots, and one of them could be, of course, you complete the Abraham Accords, and one of them you involve that also a way of dealing with Iran, which puts it more into the fold of the new political architecture of the Middle East, rather than always relying on it to be the bad guy outside, which in the long term doesn't help much. And so I think now, after the events which we have witnessed, tragic as they are in Gaza, and after Saudi Arabia's signaled willingness to come to an agreement with Israel and not only Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, and after Iran's radicals probably weakened a little bit, is a good time to come to an arrangement which would stabilize the Middle East in the longer term. And I think he has the chips, and if he has the willingness, the knowledge, who knows? I can't speculate on that. And on
And I
the other
mean,
side of the equation, if he continues to talk about Putin and about the Ukrainian war in terms of this is negotiations, we need them, the war needs to stop, but reducing it implicitly to just we need to figure out where to redraw the borders, then this will not end. This will just result in a stalemate and in a frozen conflict, because this war is not about who governs a few poor, impoverished ex-Soviet republics. No, this war really is about restoring an order, at least in Europe, which prevents countries from attacking each other just because somebody has a bad morning.
of course, and of course, we've had Trump making his own threats on semi-European territory. When you look at the Greenland, threat, I suppose, etc. Christof, before we let you go, I mean, in the context of the forward-looking sort of, I suppose, if we look at the first half of the year at least, relative peace in the Middle East. Last year we had a lot of geopolitical sort of activity, and yet the risk factor on the price didn't really factor in because of supply, admittedly, and weak demand. If you had to give me an average for oil prices in the first half of the year, would you say we'll stay in the range that we've been in for the last few months, given that so many dynamics that have changed, and yet the oil price really hasn't budged much?
Never put a price in
Yeah,
that point in time
a
or a period
band, a
of time in
band.
the same sentence. It depends if we see a bigger adjustment, like OPEC moving out away from this holding on to spare capacity because they have to, then this may be a major change in flows in the markets. There may be a period of volatility in prices, including higher prices. The same on the tariff front. If it continues to be something which is going to be applied to energy markets as well and continues to be high, we will see a period of volatility with upward movements in the short term before things settle down. These are market disruptions. But if you look at the market as it is without any disruptions at the so-called fundamentals, it's an oversupplied market. There's no reason for oil prices to be anywhere close to where they are right now. Most forecasts are of excess supply in 2025 of a demand increase of 1 million and excess supply increase of 1.5 million. That's in this market a sizable margin and should put downward pressure on the market. So I would think that we see a very volatile first half at least, and then it gradually will sink in that there's enough for everybody, and hopefully then the situation will stabilize. And that, of course, that is something OPEC needs to think about, because that would box them really in a situation where it will become very difficult to increase their supplies again without going through a period of adjustment, this time on the downside, by saying, okay, we restore our market share and we let prices drop for half a year, and like in the 80s, and then it might turn out to be much longer because we want to get out of the box. So in order to avoid this, I think it's a good idea to do the adjustment now and use these sanctions and these disruptions which we have to good purpose, rather than waiting for everything to stabilize and then look around and having to renegotiate.
Christof, Rühl, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today on Halftime Talk. It's been great to have you.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you. Thanks for having me.